that works in the transportation sector and what they're required to do in order to maintain compliance, but more importantly, to try and protect public safety.
Yeah. So it's my understanding that these types of jobs are called safety sensitive. What other industries, well, if you can explain that, but then also what other industries are also having to comply with drug testing because of the safety issues?
Sure. So, we have many different sectors that comply for various reasons. So obviously we have the Department of Health and Human Services, which is what kind of oversees the program, and the Department of Transportation then follows along with the actual regulatory part. So the DHHS handles and oversees with the National Certified Laboratory Program for certifying laboratories. And the Department of Transportation, of course, follows a lot of DHHS in some similarities, but most of the different modes, of course, have some slight variations in such as pilots flying the airplanes, to air traffic controllers, school bus drivers, people working on pipelines and with hazardous materials, people in mass transit, such as the city buses in our cities or subways, and or government-funded programs for the Federal Transit Administration, as well as our trains. And then, of course, all of the semis we see up and down the highways transporting the freight to and from destinations. Those are all examples of safety-sensitive positions within the Department of Transportation purview. Now, outside of that, you also have employers that will have individuals in safety-sensitive functions that maybe fit the definition even more, in that if they're operating a forklift, if they're working on a manufacturing line where they could actually cause injury to themselves or others. So these are all examples of safety sensitive defined positions, which then lead to what the requirements come to play. And you have to worry about the state laws as well, in addition to the federal requirements for all of the federal employed individuals. But you also have to consider the state that you're in, and does that state have a requirement? Or do you have a government contract that requires you to have a drug testing program? So that's really various areas that you really look at. And some state laws have clearly defined what a safety sensitive position is. So it really becomes important for us to make sure that we do the research.
Yeah. So what are the most common ways that drug tests, there's drug testing for those positions? So what are the common types of drug testing?
Sure. So, currently today, the most common is a urine drug screen. But in addition to that, there's also the ability to test for drugs in oral fluid, so saliva, as well as hair testing. There is also the ability to test for drugs with a sweat patch, fingernail testing. So there's many different methods in where you're able to detect drugs in an individual based on any of those testing type methodologies. But for the Department of Transportation today, the only one that is approved is urine. We are soon going to see oral fluid. As soon as the device and the two laboratories get certified, oral fluid will then become a part of that as an option for the Department of Transportation covered employers. Now, when we get into what we call the non-transportation, or we call it the non-DOT area, this is those employers that have forklift operators or manufacturing facilities, but you can also see it in retail and almost every industry across the country that an employer decides they want to have a program.
Mm-hmm.
So they may use any of the other methodologies that I mentioned, because those methodologies, of course, have a laboratory that is certified and is able to test those samples for those employers and provide them with a result.
Yeah. So in these safety sensitive jobs, what is the cadence of the drug testing of those employees?
Sure. So it always starts off with a pre-employment drug test. So the negative pre-employment drug test is needed before the actual individual begins to perform that safety sensitive function.
Mm-hmm.
From there, then depending on which mode of transportation you're working in, the individual will go into a random testing pool.
Mm-hmm.
And based on each of the modes, there is a requirement for how often the testing must be conducted. Mm-hmm. So randomly, I use the example with the trucking industry. Mm-hmm. So this industry tests those drivers, 50% of them per year for drugs, and then 10% for alcohol. Wow. And each of the modes may be a little different. But for the purposes with, the trucks and the school buses, those folks, those drivers go into a pool and 50% of them are tested annually. So wow. that cadence really comes where we do it every quarter. So every 3 months, there's a selection that occurs, mm-hmm. and that employer is provided with the list of individuals that need to be tested, and they will then comply. Now, in addition to that, the employer also has responsibility with regards to post-accident testing. So whenever there happens to be an accident defined by the regulation for that mode, they will then be required to do drug and alcohol testing. Mm-hmm. There's also reasonable suspicion. So employers have their supervisors trained on the signs and symptoms and being able to determine when we're going to request a test. And then lastly, for individuals that do test positive, we then have the final two categories, which are return to duty. This is done after an individual goes through counseling. Mm-hmm. And then we have follow-up testing, which is that checks and balance, if you will, on the individual for a period of time to ensure that they are complying with the actual recommendations of the substance abuse professional. So that's really the cadence on how it really works within the Department of Transportation. And it's almost very similar, if not the same, in the non-transportation sector. Employers still will choose to do all of the types of testing that they wish to do based on what company policy they've written. And they just may have a different percentage of how many they're going to test when they're doing randoms.
Yeah. Well, okay, I want to go back to the signs and symptoms.
Sure, absolutely.
I want to know, what are the signs that someone may be under the influence of cannabis when they're on the job?
Sure. So, this one has really become an interesting topic because there's many different things that a person can look for, but when we look for what we call reasonable suspicion, we look at physical, behavioral, and performance indicators. So there's